Greetings. Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, verses 90 and 91. I'm doing these two verses together because even though they teach two different practices, they're closely related practices. They're both practices related to a specific sound in the Sanskrit alphabet. So we are still in the quite long section of the text called Daily Life Practices, and we're almost done with that section, and soon we'll begin a very juicy and rich section of the text on contemplative practices. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now let's get into these verses. Verse 90. Abindum avisargaṃ cha akāraṃ japato mahān udeti devi sahasā jñānaughaḥ parameśvaraḥ. One who repeats the phoneme a without anusvāra or visarga may experience the sudden and powerful flood of insight that is identical with the highest divinity. So this is one of those practices which is extraordinarily simple, and yet the text promises a very, very high attainment, or at least a very high experience from this extremely simple practice. So that may or may not be the case for you, but I'll break down the simple practice here. It revolves around the phoneme a. Now, when we're talking about Sanskrit, it's more correct to use the terminology phoneme instead of letter, because letter implies something written, and phoneme is a fundamental sound unit of a given language. So Sanskrit doesn't really have an alphabet. It has a syllabary, meaning to say fundamental sound units rather than letters, because it's primarily an oral and phonetic language, not primarily a written language. And indeed, the most ancient texts in Sanskrit, the Vedas, which are also the most ancient texts in any Indo-European language, were not written down for many centuries, even almost 2,000 years. They were not written down. They were composed orally, they were passed on orally as well, and were only written down much later. And yet they were transmitted with perfect fidelity over all those centuries, which is considered one of the great intangible wonders of the world. And linguists have studied that phenomenon. Now the tantras, by contrast, were written down. They do represent originally oral teachings, but they were written down fairly early on, meaning to say they didn't have a long oral life in general. Some of these teachings would be around for a century or two before they were written down. But in general, Tantra was a tradition that textualized itself fairly quickly, as opposed to the Vedic tradition. Anyway, the very first sound of the Sanskrit language is the most fundamental sound in any language, which is simply the sound a. And this is often called a schwa sound by linguists. It's a sound that exists in all languages and is the most basic sound that the human vocal apparatus can make. Just simply a. So phonetically, some people transcribe it as a UH for English speakers, but in the standard system of transliteration for Sanskrit, we transliterate it with an A, a letter A, in the Latin alphabet. So it doesn't matter how it's transcribed. The important thing is that the first sound in the language, the first phoneme of the syllabary is a. And again, it's the simplest sound that your vocal apparatus can make. So here in the verse, we are told, abindum avisargaṃ cha, akāraṃ japato mahān, which simply means one who repeats or goes on repeating this phoneme a without any modification. So it's with a bindu, or also known as anusvāra, would be pronounced on. A nasal visarga would be pronounced aha. And these are the different vowel modifications that are possible. And here we're told, no, just all by itself, just the sound a. One who fully experiences the repetition of this sound may experience a sudden and powerful flood of insight, jñānaughaḥ. And that's a surprising phrase, flood of insight. Right? We might expect calmness or peace of mind or something like that, but no, it says a flood of insight can come, and that flood of insight, and this is of course wordless insight that's being referred to, or a flood of awareness it could be, but jnana usually means insight. This flood of insight is identical with the highest divinity. This state of being suffused with wordless, non-conceptual insight is the ideal result of this simple practice of the phoneme a. Also, we get a little reminder here that this text is a dialogue. That's another kind of way the tradition preserves the idea of an oral transmission, that the tantras are often couched as a dialogue between Shiva and Shakti. So here Bhairava is saying to Bhairavi, O goddess, devi, one who repeats the phoneme a without vowel modification, without anusvāra or visarga, may experience this sudden and powerful flood of insight. This mahān sahasā jñānaughaḥ, which is identical with the highest divinity, parameśvaraḥ. So, the practice is as simple as could be, just meditating on the sound a. And we know from an earlier verse, which taught a very similar practice, that it's very important to pay attention to the onset and fade out of the sound. Right? Feel it coming and notice its release as well. If you could actually become absorbed in the sound a, the rhythmic sound a, perhaps like a gentle pulsation, like a gentle spanda, a pulsation of awareness, you can experience profound stillness. That's what I experience. I don't know that I've experienced this flood of insight per se, but certainly intensified awareness is something that I can experience in this practice, and maybe you can too. Maybe just take a few seconds now just to explore the sound a. Doesn't even need to be audible. So soft, it's not really audible, but felt. It's one way I like to do it. Notice how, if you're ready, it can bring on presence, simple presence. Now let's look at the closely related technique of verse 91, Yukti number 66. And this is focusing on the sound visarga. Now you might remember that in the very beginning of the Yuktis, Yukti number 1, it's also called visarga. And there visarga means the two dots, or the 2 points of stillness, one in the base of the heart and one above the crown of the head. And here visarga means a specific sound, which is written in Sanskrit as 2 dots. So that's why it has the same name here, that visarga means these 2 dots stacked vertically. But here it refers to this specific sound. Now, this sound of visarga is transliterated in the Latin alphabet as H with a dot under it. And that H with a dot means that you echo the preceding vowel. So it's actually impossible to say what this sound is except in a specific context, right? So, for example, the word namaha, which is a form of the word namas, as in namaste. Namaha, we find it at the end of invocation mantras. Om Shri Mahalakshmyai Namaha. There's the visarga, namaha. But if the visarga is at the end of a word where the preceding vowel is different, then you echo that vowel, you see, because visarga means, in this context of the Sanskrit language, it means echo the preceding vowel with an intervening H sound. So, for example, in the tantric bija, hrihi, there's a visarga, and because the vowel is E, hri, you echo that sound. So you get hrihi. Right? So whatever the preceding vowel is, that's what you echo when you see that H with a dot. Now, most people don't actually use proper transliteration, so it can be hard to know when there's actually a visarga. But I've given you 2 examples. At the terminus of virtually any invocation mantra, you get namaha. And then you've got this tantric bija, which I'll write. Oh, I can't actually do the H with a dot with this keyboard. See, that's the problem. So I'll copy that in afterwards. But hrihi, hrihi. So in this practice, you really focus on the visarga. So let's look at the actual verse 91. varṇasya savisargasya visargāntaṃ citiṃ kuru nirādhāreṇa cittena spṛśed brahma sanātanam. Focus awareness on the end of the visarga sound of a mantric syllable that has a visarga. When the mind has become supportless, nirādhāreṇa, free of the need for any external support, one may touch the eternal absolute. So, by focusing on this visarga, you could just perhaps repeat namaha, namaha, namaha. Focusing really intently on the visarga. Or if you prefer a tantric bija, again there's this one, hrihi, hrihi. You focus on that visarga. And little by little, the mind, the citta, becomes nirādhāreṇa, supportless. supportless, meaning free of the need for any external support, totally absorbed in itself, is what that word implies. And in this way, you can, metaphorically speaking, touch the eternal absolute, the sanātanam brahma. Okay? Spṛśed brahma sanātanam. Could it really be that easy? Yes, it could, because the eternal absolute, by definition, is everywhere all the time. It's the very context of your experience. The eternal absolute is present in the same way that water is to fish, right? For a fish, water is the very medium of its existence. It moves in water. It is supported on all sides by water. It breathes water. And same goes for the divine, the universal consciousness, the eternal absolute. It's literally all around us, pervading us, supporting us, and it is with its support that we exist at all. So yes, if you stop conceptualizing the absolute as something far away or abstract or transcendental, then it is possible to touch. Let your awareness encompass or be one with that sense of the eternal absolute, the sanātanam brahma, pervading everything all the time, the very medium of your existence, the very context of your existence, that by which you exist, that in which all things live and breathe. So encounter it, if you can, simply by absorbing yourself for a few minutes in the repetition of the visarga, or that previous verse, the sound ah, either one, whichever works for you. Right? We have all these alternatives in the VBT based on whatever works. And as the VBT will say later, even just a handful of the practices of this text, even though it gives 112 practices, even just any handful of them that happen to work for you, that's all you need. Right? So lay hold of and grasp firmly all those practices that work for you, and any that don't, simply lay aside and focus on the ones that do. Now the word namaha means reverence, but here you're not focusing on the meaning, just the visarga itself, the sound at the end, the terminus. Namaha. Namaha. And for those of you who know the bija mantra of the goddess Para, of the Trika lineage, that mantra also has a visarga, and I invite you to meditate on that subtle sound at the end of her bija, if you know that so-called secret bija. Okay, that's it for now, and soon we will be encountering these beautiful verses in the contemplative practices section, which begins, I believe, with verse 95. So, looking forward to that, and we'll keep having a VBT video almost every day for the foreseeable future. Om. And I'll just see if there's any questions. I don't think so. Maybe too early in the morning for folks. Enjoy your meditation. Om.